Welcome back to the deep dive. Imagine having, well, a complete personalized map to your future health.
Hmm,
A map charting every possible risk, every hidden vulnerability, and every potential defense.
right.
The territory, of course, is your own genome, but, raw data is pretty useless without interpretation.
Absolutely.
And navigating that complex, often confusing terrain requires, well, an indispensable guide.
And that guide is the genetic counselor.
Exactly.
For decades, genetic counseling, or GC, it was mainly associated with identifying and managing rare single-gene disorders.
Kind of tucked away in a hospital somewhere.
Precisely. Often a specialized service,
Oh.
but our sources show that GC is, well, it's undergoing a profound transformation.
Oh, so?
It's rapidly evolving from that niche service into, really, a central pillar of precision health.
Wow.
And it's impacting population-scale management of common diseases like cancer and heart disease. Big stuff.
And the scope of their work sounds immense then. It's fundamentally about providing, what, clinical healthcare, education?
Yes, and crucially, emotional support. For individuals and families dealing with genetic or inherited diseases,
Okay.
the mission is highly practical. It's helping people assess their risk, guiding them through testing, assisting in diagnosis and management, and ultimately, ensuring they make fully informed, autonomous decisions.
About their health, their family's future.
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, we're exploring this evolution, how the counselor's role has dramatically expanded, what core protocols they stick to worldwide, and the intense ethical tightropes and, frankly, global access issues they have to confront now in a world just swimming in genomic data.
It's interesting, when you look at genetic counseling practice globally, you see wildly different healthcare systems, right?
Yeah, the NHS in the UK, private practices in the US, worlds apart sometimes.
Worlds apart. But there's a reassuring and actually critical level of consistency in the basic professional protocol.
Really, across the board.
Yeah, this foundation is pretty much universally adopted. And it makes sense because the science of risk assessment itself stays consistent.
Okay, so let's unpack this core protocol then. If you're someone considering a genetic test, what are the universal steps you should expect from a counselor?
Okay, so it starts with the clinical essentials. First, building strong rapport that's vital for trust.
Absolutely.
And then securing truly informed consent. And in genetics, informed consent isn't just, signing a form, it's a whole process.
A real conversation.
A real conversation, exactly. Then, the counselor collects comprehensive family and medical histories. They often draw out details the patient didn't even realize were relevant. And crucially, the protocol requires them to assess and thoroughly discuss potential risks before any testing is ordered.
Before. Why is that so important?
Well, this pre-test counseling is paramount. It manages expectations about what the test might find, and maybe even more importantly, what it might not find.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. So that pre-test discussion lets the patient really weigh the potential emotional, financial, personal consequences.
Precisely.
Before the sample's even collected.
Yeah.
So if the protocol for history and consent is pretty consistent, where do the approaches start to diverge globally?
The differences usually pop up further down the line, once the data actually comes back.
Right.
They tend to diverge specifically in how counselors interpret and communicate those really complex test results, especially for unexpected findings.
Like secondary findings. We'll get to those, I'm sure.
Exactly. And also how they help promote psychological adaptation once a diagnosis is delivered. That can vary a lot.
And I guess coordinating follow-up care depends on the system, too.
Hugely. The coordination of referrals for post-test care and management is heavily dictated by the local healthcare structure. Is it a fast track to a specialist in a private system, or are you waiting for a government-funded clinic? Very different experiences.
The science is universal, but the human and logistical side is shaped by the system. Got it. Now let's look at the fundamentals of risk assessment. What exactly are genetic counselors determining? What makes them indispensable here?
Right. They're the experts in quantifying susceptibility. Based on that detailed personal and family history we talked about, they use genetic principles to figure out the probability of inheriting specific genes or conditions.
So, like, my risk of getting something or passing it on.
Both. Your chance of developing a disease yourself, the chance of passing conditions to your children, and how that info might impact, say, your siblings or other relatives. It's a sophisticated mix of epidemiology, family tree analysis, and molecular biology.
And I understand one of the most common reasons people seek GC isn't even about their own current health, but looking ahead, reproductive planning.
Absolutely. Our sources confirm that. Assessing the risk of having a child with a genetic condition is a huge driver for seeking GC.
Makes sense.
And this work, ideally, it's done preconception before the couple is even pregnant.
Why?
Because it gives the greatest window of opportunity for, well, autonomous decision-making. This kind of counseling applies to couples maybe who've had prior pregnancy losses, women who are pregnant at or after 35, where chromosomal disorder risks naturally increase, or, individuals with known exposure to toxins or known inherited conditions in the family.
And when you're counseling these couples, you mentioned preconception planning gives them the fullest range of options. What are those options? We hear acronyms like PDD, NIPT thrown around a lot.
Sure. So if screening shows a couple is at high risk, their options could include preimplantation genetic diagnosis, PGD.
That's testing embryos before IVF implantation.
Exactly. Testing embryos for specific genetic defects first, or they might choose prenatal diagnosis later in the pregnancy. Another option could be using donor gametes, sperm or eggs.
Okay.
And then there's non-invasive prenatal screening, NIPT. That analyzes DNA fragments floating in the mother's blood to check for common chromosomal issues like Down syndrome.
Yeah.
The crucial thing is, doing this counseling and screening before conception ensures these complex decisions are voluntary, they're informed, and the couple has the maximum time to really consider their path forward.
That holistic view is key. It's not just about the diagnosis. It's empowering, informed choices for potentially life-altering decisions.
Oh, wow.
Now, let's tackle that area you mentioned where things are evolving rapidly, maybe controversially. Who actually gets to order the molecular tests?
Yeah. This role has been shifting quite dramatically in some places. Traditionally, the physician ordered the test.
Right.
And the genetic counselor's role was more to identify the right tests, coordinate them, interpret the results. But for example, the U.S. National Society of Genetic Counselors, the NSGC, they recently updated their scope of practice, and now it allows genetic counselors to directly order genetic laboratory tests.
Wow, that's a big step, a significant expansion of their authority. But wait, doesn't that kind of step on the physician's toes? If the goal is collaboration, why move into ordering, which has always been seen as, well, a medical domain? What were the arguments against that?
Well, that tension is definitely real, and it persists globally. The argument against often centers on the idea that ordering tests might require making a differential diagnosis first.
Something usually done by a doctor.
Exactly. A step historically reserved for an MD. And there were worries that expanding the role could lead to regulatory hurdles or pushback from medical societies.
Okay, so what were the arguments for it then? Why let counselors order?
The argument for it is really rooted in efficiency and expertise.
Efficiency, how?
Well, think about it. Genetic counselors are the specialists in test selection. In complex cases, they know exactly which large panel or whole exome or specific test is the most appropriate.
Right, they live and breathe this stuff.
They do. So eliminating that extra step of routing the request through a physician who might not be as up to speed on the latest genomic tech, it just streamlines the whole process for the patient.
Makes sense. Get the right test faster.
Exactly. Proponents see this expansion as crucial for enhancing clinical utility, making sure the correct test is done first time, and really positioning the counselor as an independent provider in this fast-moving field. But like you said, our sources note this ambiguity about who orders tests. It continues to be a defining boundary or maybe a battleground in many healthcare systems worldwide.
So the counselor's authority is expanding, partly because the sheer scale of the information they handle has just exploded. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about that semantic wrestling match.
Okay.
Personalized medicine versus precision medicine. Is there a real difference, or is it just rebranding?
It's fascinating because that terminology shift wasn't just like corporate buzzwords. It was actually a necessary professional reaction.
Right.
Well, physicians often felt personalized medicine was kind of redundant.
Like we already do that.
Exactly. We always practice in a way that considers the patient's personal characteristics. They felt it almost trivialized their existing clinical skills.
Right. I talk to my patients. I personalize their care already.
Precisely. So the term precision medicine emerged, and it implied something much more objective, more systematized care integration based heavily on genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, all that large-scale data.
Suggests something more algorithmic, data-driven.
Right. And this evolved further into a more complex concept, P4 medicine, coined by Dr. Lee Hood.
P4, what does that stand for?
Predictive, personalized, preventive, and participatory.
P4 sounds like a kind of mission statement for future healthcare. But how does that philosophy really change what a genetic counselor does day to day? It sounds like they shift from being, I don't know, a reactive diagnostician to more of a proactive risk modeler.
That's exactly the core insight. The GC's role shifts dramatically. A reactive diagnostician, they handle a known rare condition, right? Patient has symptoms, counselor helps find the cause. A P4-focused counselor is proactive. They're using genomic data not just for a current problem, but to calculate the probability of future disease.
Wow.
This involves coordinating preventive strategies, maybe targeted drugs, special diets, lifestyle changes based on that genomic data, often way before symptoms appear.
And the participatory part.
That means the counselor has to empower the patient to be an active agent in managing their own health data, constantly engaging, following up, refining that risk assessment over time. It's ongoing.
But then precision health came along, another term. What does that emphasize that maybe precision medicine didn't quite capture? And how does it push GC even further outside the clinic walls?
Yeah, precision health is kind of the latest iteration. It's a rebranding that focuses heavily on the societal, the population scale impact of genomics.
Ah, broader than just one patient.
Much broader. It emphasizes targeted risk mitigation to stop disease symptoms from ever developing in the first place. So this expands the scope way beyond the individual clinic visit and into public health, looking at large groups, large cohorts.
So like identifying groups at high risk for certain cancers.
Exactly. The CDC now even uses the term precision public health, identifying high-risk cohorts, maybe people with familial hypercholesterolemia or hereditary breast ovarian cancer risks, and deploying targeted screening programs for them, rather than just relying on one-on-one specialist referrals after the fact.
Okay, but the moment you talk population scale genomics, you crash right into the challenge of next generation sequencing,
Yeah.
NGS.
Oh, yeah.
Things like gene panels, whole exome sequencing, WES, whole genome sequencing, WGS. They produce just vast amounts of information all at once. Information overload seems inevitable.
NGS is revolutionary, no doubt. Speed, depth, amazing. But it's absolutely a double-edged sword for interpretation.
How so?
It generates data for hundreds, sometimes thousands of genetic variants simultaneously. So the counselor now has to be the synthesizer,
Filter?
the filter, the interpreter, sifting through all this data to find the clinical signal amidst the noise, rather than just delivering one clear result like in the old days. This huge jump in complexity really challenges those older models of genetic consultation.
And this leads us straight into maybe the core professional headache of modern genetics. The variant of unknown significance, or VUS.
Ah, the variant dilemma, yes. When we do NGS, we often find a VUS. It's a genetic variant where we simply don't know yet what it means for health.
Benign, pathogenic, no idea.
Exactly. We just don't have enough data to classify it definitively yet. And the genetic counselors, they're the ones responsible for estimating the risks associated with that VUS. And that's where it gets incredibly difficult. How do you counsel someone when the answer is basically maybe?
That sounds like a huge psychological burden for the patient, to be told you have something but nobody knows what it means.
It's massive. The uncertainty creates enormous, often generalized anxiety. The counselor's first job is often managing that panic, carefully explaining that a VUS is a category of scientific uncertainty. It's not actually a diagnosis.
Can they do anything to try and figure it out?
Sometimes. To try and classify a VUS, counselors might use methods like indirect linkage analysis.
What's that?
It means they look at how the variant is inherited within the family, the pedigree. If the VUS consistently tracks with the disease only in affected family members, it becomes more likely over time to be reclassified as pathogenic, even if the primary scientific evidence is still lagging.
Wow, that requires some serious detective work. Now let's talk about those findings that weren't the main point of the test, the ethical tightrope of incidental versus secondary findings. The terminology here seems deliberately, maybe confusingly complex.
It is complex, and the distinction is really crucial. The American College of Medical Genetics, ACMG, they shifted from calling them incidental findings to secondary findings, or SFs.
Why the shape?
Because these specific findings are often intentionally analyzed and reported, regardless of why the test was ordered in the first place.
Ah, so they aren't accidental slip-ups. They're specific, medically actionable genes. You said there are 59 currently defined.
That's right, 59 actionable genes.
And the medical community basically agrees it would be negligent not to look for these and report them if found.
Precisely. They are deliberately sought, because knowing about them can significantly change care. They're actionable. Meanwhile, you'll hear the European Society for Human Genetics use the term unsolicited finding, or UF,
Okay.
but this whole area creates huge ethical tension, especially when sequencing children.
How so?
Well, imagine finding a secondary finding for an adult-onset condition, like a BRCA1 mutation linked to cancer risk in a child, reporting that could deprive the child of their right to decide later in life as an adult whether they even want that information, their right not to know.
Wow, yeah, that's heavy.
It is, and it mandates extreme transparency up front. Patients, research participants, they must be told in advance that these specific findings might be generated, and they have to consent to the protocol for how or if they'll be disclosed.
Given all this complexity, the sheer volume of data, it's clear genetic counselors can't just be sitting in a traditional hospital clinic anymore. Where else are they practicing now?
The expansion is vast. They're moving out of purely clinical settings into genetic testing labs themselves, working on interpretation, writing the reports.
Makes sense.
They're vital in research departments, in commercial companies developing these tests, government agencies setting policy, and importantly, they're becoming embedded within medical specialties.
Like oncology, cardiology.
Exactly. Oncology, cardiology, neurology, serving as the dedicated genomic lead for those teams right there in the specialty clinic.
And we even see this huge expansion reflected in how the professional societies are defining the role now.
Yes, absolutely. The Human Genetics Society of Australasia, HGSA, for instance, they've explicitly expanded their scope of practice to cover 6 distinct formalized types of genetic counselors.
6 types, what are they?
Clinical, industry, academic, policy, research, and education.
Wow. Why is formally defining those 6 types significant? Does it mean, say, the counselor working for a big testing company has different ethics or priorities than one in an NHS clinic?
It's significant because it's a formal acknowledgement that the context fundamentally changes the ethical calculations and the day-to-day professional priorities.
Okay.
The academic GC might be focused on population recruitment, data integrity for research. The industry GC has to balance commercial viability with communicating test results clearly and ethically. They all share core educational principles, sure, but the specific legal duties, the professional responsibilities, they shift quite dramatically depending on whether the primary stakeholder is an individual patient, a research cohort, or, a commercial enterprise.
That makes sense. Finally, let's bring this back to the biggest scale, public health. How is GC integrating into that broader world of preventing common diseases?
The CDC, for example, views genetic counseling as absolutely essential for integrating genomics effectively into public health initiatives, especially for common diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease.
Down they up there.
Well, counselors enhance public awareness, boost genetic literacy in the population, they contribute to policy discussions, and fundamentally they're seen as essential drivers for making genomic medicine actually successful in practice.
So they make sure the discoveries actually help people.
Right. They're pivotal in ensuring that huge population-wide genomic screening programs actually translate into real, actionable health improvements for people, rather than just generating mountains of confusing data.
And a prime example of that huge scale is the All of Us research program in the U.S., right? Sequencing millions of people.
Precisely. The All of Us program requires extensive GC support for every single participant who gets sequencing results back, especially those with secondary findings.
Every participant. That's a huge undertaking.
It is. And it's a clear acknowledgement by a major government initiative that you cannot responsibly deliver complex sequencing data without specialized, personalized counseling. The sheer scale of need there really underscores the massive workforce training challenge we're facing globally. We just touched on the immense cost and complexity of NGS technologies. And, well, those high costs inevitably create massive global disparities in access.
Right. So while the goals of genetic counseling might be universal education, autonomy, support, the actual practice gets heavily shaped by local factors.
Exactly. Regional cultural norms, language barriers, and critically, how the health system is structured and funded.
Let's dig into a specific example you mentioned, the Hong Kong case study. What were the unique hurdles they faced there that led them to create a consortium to try and standardize practice?
Yeah, Hong Kong is a fascinating microcosm of these colliding forces. First off, historically, they lacked an accredited local training program for GCs.
So people were trained inconsistently.
Very inconsistently. It often led to diverse standards of practice, maybe based on ad hoc, on-the-job training, rather than a unified curriculum. Then, culturally, they faced significant barriers.
Like what?
Traditional values often prioritize family reputation, sort of collective honor, over individual disclosure.
Ah, so reluctance to share bad news within the family.
Exactly. Reluctance to openly discuss or share genetic issues, which can be seen as bringing shame or bad luck onto the family.
I can imagine that makes something like cascade testing, which is key for preventing inherited cancers, incredibly difficult. If the first person diagnosed refuses to tell relatives because of stigma.
It makes it extremely challenging. The counselor has to use really culturally competent, sensitive strategies to encourage disclosure, but without violating that primary patient's autonomy. It's a fine line.
Well,
Compounding this is a significant bilingual challenge. Cantonese and English are both widely used. Communicating highly complex, nuanced genetic information accurately across languages.
especially with interpreters.
Right, often requires relying on interpreters, which always introduces a risk of error or subtle misunderstanding. And on top of that, the public healthcare system there might not have prioritized GC as a standard, routinely reimbursed service.
Creating access issues based on ability to pay.
Exactly. Disparities in access depending on whether a patient can afford to go private or has to rely on potentially limited public services.
This whole issue of patient access versus clinical reality is just blown wide open everywhere by direct-to-consumer or DTC genetic testing.
Oh, DTC. Yeah, that's a global phenomenon that throws a huge wrench into the clinical system.
How so? I mean, people were just curious, right?
Well, DTC testing has seen sustained, really explosive growth, but often for non-clinical reasons. Our sources show a big majority, maybe around 65% of consumers get these tests primarily to learn about their heritage, their ancestry.
Right, find out if they're 10% Viking or whatever.
Exactly. Not necessarily for clinical risk assessment. But the results inevitably contain health information, sometimes alarming health information, which leads to confusion, sometimes outright panic.
And regulatory bodies, like the FDA in the US, they've had to step in because of this clinical ambiguity, haven't they?
They have. The FDA famously required companies like 23andMe to stop providing certain health information until they could get proper authorization, proving clinical validity for those claims.
Right.
And even with authorization, the current FDA guidance is really clear. DTC results should not be used for diagnosis or making treatment decisions without confirmation testing in a certified clinical-grade laboratory.
Why not? If the test says you have the variant.
Because many DTC tests screen for variants that are mainly relevant in one specific population group, or they might use sequencing technology that just isn't rigorous enough for clinical decisions, the quality control isn't the same.
So the challenge for the genetic counselor then is huge. The patient walks in, maybe terrified, clutching this raw, unverified DTC report.
Exactly. They arrive with this information, sometimes scary information, but completely without the necessary expert context. The counselor's first job is often just managing the panic.
De-escalation.
De-escalation and synthesis. That's where the counselor really earns their keep. The patient sees high-risk variant for cancer, but the counselor has to explain, well, actually, that variant might only matter if your ancestry is X, or the lab method used here isn't reliable enough. We need to confirm this result clinically before anyone takes action.
They're like the gatekeepers, making sure raw data doesn't lead to, I don't know, unnecessary surgeries or bad diagnoses.
Precisely. Gatekeepers and interpreters. Now, let's tie this back to those health system disparities. The funding model makes a massive difference globally, starting with the U.S. primarily private payer focus.
Right, driven by insurance companies.
Yeah, the U.S. system is heavily driven by commercial forces, which on the one hand arguably accelerated the clinical adoption of advanced tech like NIPT and WES, WGS.
But the downside?
Access. Accessibility hinges almost entirely on justifying medical necessity to private insurers, and that's often a lengthy bureaucratic battle. Counselors spend significant time writing justification letters, appealing denials, navigating high deductibles.
So if you can't prove, the test will immediately change treatment.
Access can be limited only to those who can afford to pay thousands out of pocket. It creates a real two-tier system.
Okay, contrast that sharply with publicly funded systems, like the UK's NHS or in Canada.
Right. In those systems, the government generally pays for GC services. Decisions about which tests get covered, whether it's routine NIPT or complex WES, are usually based on strict criteria. Demonstrated medical necessity, clinical utility, and often rigorous national cost-effectiveness analyses.
So access, when approved, is equitable.
Generally, yes. Access is equitable and government paid if you meet the criteria. But the major downside there is often long wait times in the public sector.
Which can be critical if you're dealing with pregnancy decisions or aggressive cancer risks.
Exactly. Time is often of the essence. And finally, you have the mixed systems, like Australia or South Africa.
What challenges do they face?
Well, these mixed systems have their own unique issues. A mix of public and private access almost inevitably leads to growing disparity. Those who can afford private care often bypass these sometimes extensive wait times in the public system.
And South Africa has specific cost issues.
Yeah, South Africa faces particular challenges with cost. Because NGS testing is so expensive locally, patients sometimes end up using international laboratories for their tests.
Which must create headaches for follow-up.
Massive complexity for local insurance coverage, for coordinating follow-up care. The system struggles to manage this flow of data coming from labs operating under different regulations outside their direct control.
And all these disparities, they ultimately tie back to a really practical day-to-day challenge, actually paying the genetic counselors themselves. If they're hard to hire, patients wait longer, quality can suffer.
This is a huge structural problem impacting care quality everywhere. Reimbursement rates for genetic counseling services are often pretty low, especially relative to the complexity and the sheer time required.
How long does a session take?
Well, a comprehensive initial counseling session can easily take an hour, hour and a half, maybe longer. That dramatically limits how many patients a counselor can realistically see in a day.
Okay.
So this low capacity, combined with often poor reimbursement, makes it really difficult for individual practices, say smaller oncology clinics, to actually hire a full-time counselor. The revenue generated often just doesn't cover the specialized salary.
So to get around that, clinics have to find workarounds.
They absolutely do. Often, practices are forced to either partner formally with larger local hospitals that can maybe absorb the costs within a bigger budget,
Sure.
or they end up having to invest significant time and money trying to educate primary care physicians, PCPs, to do the initial screening, to correctly identify and triage high-risk individuals for eventual referral.
But that delays access to the actual expert.
It does. And this reliance on non-specialist PCPs for that crucial first step, well, it risks inaccurate referrals, missed cases, or delayed testing. High-quality GC requires specialized training, particularly in complex areas like cancer genetics, and knowing how to interpret those tricky, uninformative results, which can be just as confusing for a patient as a positive one.
Okay, let's move now into the really high-stakes applications, where the counselor's guidance directly impacts, well, life and death decisions or life-altering reproductive choices, starting with carrier screening.
Right, carrier screening. That's testing performed on someone who is healthy themselves but might carry one copy, one variant allele for a recessive condition.
Like cystic fibrosis.
Like cystic fibrosis, exactly. And the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, they universally recommend that information about carrier screening and the counseling that goes with it should be provided to every pregnant woman, ideally pre-conception.
Again, back to enabling that widest range of reproductive options.
Exactly. Options like pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, PGD, using donor gametes, or simply being prepared.
And we've seen some major conditions move from being screened only in certain groups to universal screening recommendations recently, right?
We have screening for spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, for example. It's now recommended for all women considering pregnancy or currently pregnant, regardless of their ethnicity.
Why the change?
Mostly due to the severe nature of the disease and the increasing availability of treatments. Similarly, population-based carrier screening for cystic fibrosis is strongly promoted. And again, because the goal is maximizing autonomy, this counseling is often encouraged before pregnancy, sometimes even in non-clinical settings, to really promote voluntary decision-making away from the time pressures of an active pregnancy.
But ethnicity still plays a big role in recommendations for other conditions, based on higher prevalence in certain populations.
It does, especially for the hemoglobinopathies, things like sickle cell disease and the thalassemias. Screening for those is generally recommended based on ethnicity.
Which groups?
Individuals of African, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, or West Indian descent. And importantly, to screen properly for these, you don't just need a DNA test. You also need a complete blood count, a CBC, along with something called hemoglobin electrophoresis to get an accurate picture of carrier status.
Okay. And what about conditions prevalent in the Ashkenazi Jewish population?
Right. For individuals of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, screening is recommended for a whole panel of autosomal recessive conditions that are more common in that population. Tay-Sachs is the classic example, but also cystic fibrosis, and others.
Now, what happens if you have a couple where one partner is from a high prevalence group, like Ashkenazi Jewish, but the other partner isn't?
Yeah, that's a common counseling scenario and adds complexity. If one partner is identified as a carrier for one of these Ashkenazi Jewish conditions, the other partner should definitely be offered screening too.
There's a but, isn't there?
There is. The counselor must inform the couple that the carrier frequency, and more importantly, the detection rate of the test in non-Jewish individuals is often poorly understood or lower for many of these specific disorders.
So a negative result might not be as reassuring.
Exactly. It introduces uncertainty into the risk prediction. You might get a negative result for the non-Jewish partner, but that negative might not rule out carrier status as effectively as it would in the high prevalence population. Requires really careful, nuanced communication about residual risk.
Okay. Moving from reproduction to cancer risk management. Genetic counseling is obviously critical for specific hereditary syndromes and this idea of cascade testing.
Absolutely. Cascade testing is the essential public health mechanism here. It happens when a specific pathogenic mutation, a harmful genetic change, is found in one family member.
That creates an urgent need to inform relatives.
An urgent medical opportunity for relatives, yeah. The counselor then informs the initial patient about the familial risk and the importance of sharing this information. We see this being critical in key hereditary cancer syndromes, like hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, often caused by BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutations, which can dramatically increase lifetime cancer risks.
And what are some other major high-risk syndromes where this kind of aggressive cascade approach is needed?
Other key examples include Lynch syndrome, that used to be called HNPCC. It's caused by defects in genes like MLH1 or MSH2, and it significantly increases the risk of colorectal cancer, stomach cancer, sometimes others too.
Yeah.
There's also the very aggressive Liefrau-Meny syndrome linked to defects in the TP53 gene, and familial adenomatous polyposis, or FAP, caused by APC gene defects, leading to hundreds or thousands of colon polyps and near certain colon cancer if untreated, sometimes adrenal tumors too.
So cascade testing ensures that relatives who find out they also carry the family mutation can take action.
Precisely. They can get enhanced screenings like starting colonoscopies much younger, or having breast MRIs instead of just mammograms. Or they might consider prophylactic surgery options like mastectomy or colectomy. These actions can dramatically reduce their risk of developing or dying from the cancer.
This essential public health tool, cascade testing, it immediately slams up against probably the thorniest legal and ethical issue in genetics. The duty to warn versus patient privacy. This is the real genetic tightrope walk, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The ethical core of the profession, really. And we see this tension starkly illustrated in that landmark ABC lawsuit concerning Huntington's disease.
Can you remind us of the details there?
Sure. In that case, the father was diagnosed with Huntington's, which is incurable, neurodegenerative, and highly predictable based on the gene test.
Yeah.
He explicitly told his medical team he did not want his diagnosis disclosed to his pregnant daughter, ABC. He feared the social or psychological harm it might cause her.
Okay. And ABC later sued the medical team for negligence.
Yeah.
Right? Claiming they owed her a duty of care that should have overridden her father's confidentiality, especially since she was pregnant and unknowingly faced a 50% risk herself.
Exactly. And the ultimate finding through the court process was profound. It determined that medical professionals do owe a legal duty to at least consider the rights and interests of identifiable genetic relatives whose risk of significant harm, like from an incurable, predictable disease like Huntington's, could potentially be reduced by disclosure. And that duty to the relative may, in certain extreme circumstances, prevail over the primary patient's absolute right to confidentiality.
Wow. That forces the counselor into an almost impossible position. A Sophie's choice moment. Whose welfare prevails?
Yeah.
The patient's privacy or the relative's potential health?
It's a fundamental tension, requires intense legal and ethical calculus, often involving ethics committees or legal counsel. But, and this is a crucial legal boundary providers must strictly observe, particularly in the U.S. Despite this duty to consider the relative, under laws like IPA, the situation is complex. While the tested patient is strongly encouraged, even counseled that they have a moral, maybe medical duty to notify their relatives.
The provider shouldn't call the relatives themselves.
The provider generally should not contact at-risk family members directly. Doing so risks violating the primary patient's privacy rights under HIPAA and could open the provider to significant liability. The professional duty is usually seen as counseling the patient on their responsibility to disclose, not usurping that responsibility and directly notifying the family. It's about empowering the patient to warn, not warning for them.
Okay, that distinction is critical. Finally, let's address one of the biggest fears patients have when they think about genetic testing: the fear of genetic discrimination.
Yeah, patient fears about losing their job or their insurance based on a high-risk genetic result, say, finding out they have a BRCA1 mutation or carry a marker for Lynch syndrome. Those are legitimate concerns. They absolutely must be addressed thoroughly in pre-test counseling.
What protections exist, say, in the U.S.?
In the U.S., the key federal protection is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, passed back in 2008.
And what does GINA do?
GINA protects people against discrimination in health insurance. Things like eligibility, coverage, premiums based on their genetic information or family history. It also protects against discrimination in employment decisions: hiring, firing, promotion.
And didn't the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, also help by banning denial of coverage for pre-existing conditions, which would include having a known pathogenic variant?
Yes, the ACA added another layer of protection for health insurance access for people with pre-existing conditions, including genetic ones. And this is a big, but GINA is not a comprehensive shield. It has significant gaps.
It doesn't cover everything.
No, and this is where genetic counselors have to be extremely precise and clear in their communication before testing. GINA does not protect against genetic discrimination when people are trying to obtain other crucial types of insurance,
Like what?
like life insurance, long-term care insurance, or disability insurance. Those insurance carriers can still legally ask for and use genetic information to make decisions about eligibility or premiums.
Wow. So finding a high-risk result could make it much harder or more expensive to get life insurance to protect your family.
It absolutely could. It creates potentially significant financial challenges for individuals with high-risk results who need to plan for their family's financial security. The counselor must proactively explain this loophole before the patient consents to testing so they understand the full range of potential consequences.
So wrapping this up, what really stands out in this deep dive is just how much the genetic counselor has evolved. From, a specialist dealing mostly with rare diseases into this absolutely necessary multifaceted interpreter, translating these massive, complex genomic data sets from WES, WGS, even DTC tests into knowledge that's individualized, understandable, and actually actionable for the patient.
They really are the keystone profession of the genomic era, no question. They bridge that critical gap between the complex science and a person's ability to make informed, autonomous decisions about it.
Yeah.
And we've seen that despite those huge systemic differences globally in funding, in access, maybe the most consistent positive impact of genetic counseling is the counselor's unique ability to synthesize all this information and, crucially, manage the profound uncertainty, like that VUS dilemma that modern sequencing inevitably creates.
And this expanding role demands incredible flexibility, doesn't it? And real cultural competence, since the practice has to adapt to all these different local contexts.
Absolutely. Beyond just the economic differences between, say, the US and UK systems, they have to be profoundly culturally competent. We talked about navigating those complex dynamics around family versus individual privacy in places like Hong Kong or Korea,
Right.
or understanding and respecting religious norms that might impact reproductive options, for instance. Certain Islamic teachings might limit procreation strictly within wedlock, potentially ruling out the use of third-party donor gametes. These are deeply personal, culturally embedded issues.
So it's this highly personalized, really high-stakes service.
Yeah.
But now it's operating or needing to operate at a population scale.
Indeed. And if we connect this back to that ultimate challenge we touched on, we know millions upon millions of people worldwide are now slated to be sequenced in these massive government and population health initiatives, right? Like all of us here, national biobanks elsewhere.
Yeah, the scale is unprecedented.
It is. So if genetic counseling is truly that single vital component, the thing needed to ensure genuine informed consent, to interpret those complex secondary findings responsibly and provide that essential personalized support, well, it raises a huge question for global policymakers. How can global health systems possibly train and deploy enough specialized personnel rapidly enough to match this immense growing scale of testing capacity? And how can they do that without compromising the very quality of the individualized, deeply ethical, person-centered support that actually defines the profession? That, perhaps, is the defining infrastructural challenge of the genomic decade ahead.